Hey guys, tonight we're easing gently into ancient Rome. So go ahead and dim the lights. Maybe lower your screen brightness until everything looks vaguely historical. Get comfortable. You don't need to learn anything. You don't need to remember names. This is not one of those histories. This is the kind where facts drift by politely, like background noise. And occasionally, something mildly ironic taps you on the shoulder and then apologizes. Because tonight, we're talking about what life in ancient Rome was actually like. Not the movie version, not the clean, marble white, everyone is somehow buff version, but the real one, the smelly one, the crowded one, the deeply inconvenient one. And we'll start where most Romans did, not in a palace, not in a Senate chamber, but in an apartment that probably should have collapsed last winter. When people imagine Rome, they usually imagine emperors. Golden armor, flowing capes, dramatic speeches delivered while staring into the distance. Most Romans, however, woke up staring at a cracked ceiling. If they were lucky, it was still attached. The average Roman lived in an insula, which sounds pleasant. It means island. It was not an island. It was a multi-story apartment block made of cheap materials, rushed construction, and optimism. These buildings were tall, sometimes 6 or 7 stories, which is impressive until you remember there were no building codes and no elevators, and fires were more of a suggestion than a concern. The higher you lived, the poorer you were, because the lower floors were sturdier and closer to water access. The top floors were basically attic spaces with dreams. If the building collapsed, and many did, it usually pancaked downward, which was inconvenient for everyone involved. Rent was high. Landlords were indifferent. Maintenance was more of a philosophical concept. Roman writers loved complaining about this. Juvenal, the satirist, once noted that in Rome, you went to sleep wondering whether the building would still exist in the morning, which really sets a calming bedtime mood. Now let's talk about noise. Rome was loud, constantly. Carts were banned during the day to reduce congestion, so naturally they all ran at night instead. Imagine trying to sleep while wagons rattle past your window at 3 a.m., driven by men who had accepted chaos as a lifestyle. Vendors shouted, animals screamed, neighbors argued. Someone was always hammering something, probably unnecessarily. There was no glass in most windows, just shutters. So every sound politely entered your living space uninvited. And smell. We should talk about smell, because Rome smelled like Rome. There was no trash pickup. People threw waste into the street, sometimes from windows, which meant walking through the city required a kind of alertness. You watched your footing and occasionally the sky. Public latrines existed, which sounds progressive. They were long benches with holes, no dividers. Privacy was not a Roman value. And instead of toilet paper, there was a communal sponge on a stick, shared, rinsed, reused. Take a moment with that. You don't need to visualize it. Just let it exist quietly in the background. Baths, though, were a point of pride. Romans loved their baths. They were social hubs, political spaces, relaxation centers. They were also crowded and not especially clean. People from all walks of life bathed together. Men and women, sometimes separately, sometimes not. The water was changed occasionally, which is a generous word. People scraped oil and dirt off their skin with tools called strigils. That gunk was sometimes sold as a cosmetic ingredient, because of course it was. Still, bathing was one of the few times Romans felt vaguely civilized, so they leaned into it. Food, meanwhile, was simpler than the feasts you see on screen. Most people ate bread, a lot of bread, with maybe some olives, or porridge, or wine watered down so heavily it was more of a suggestion. Meat was rare for the poor. Vegetables were seasonal. Spices were expensive. Garum, the famous fermented fish sauce, was everywhere, and it smelled committed. Romans put garum on everything. If a dish didn't quite taste right, they added garum. If it tasted worse, they added more. This was considered culinary sophistication. Street food existed. Thermopylae sold hot meals to people whose apartments didn't have kitchens, which was many people, fire hazards and all that. So Rome was a city fueled by bread, wine, fish sauce, and vibes. Now let's talk about class, because Rome was obsessed with it. At the top were the elites, senators, equestrians, old families with impressive names and unimpressive personal hygiene. They lived in domus, single-family homes, with courtyards, fountains, slaves, so many slaves. Below them were the masses, free citizens technically, but functionally stressed. And then there were the enslaved people, millions of them, doing everything from manual labor to accounting. Rome did not function without slavery. It was baked into the system, casually, completely. And while movies often show slaves as constantly rebelling or dramatically suffering in slow motion, most of the time they were just there, working, waiting, existing within rules they did not write. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't always visibly violent, it was just relentless. Children in Rome grew up fast, if they survived infancy, which many didn't. Life expectancy was low, mostly because childhood was a gauntlet. Education depended on wealth. Rich boys learned rhetoric and philosophy. Poor kids learned trades. Girls learned domestic skills, or didn't learn much at all. Discipline was harsh. Beatings were normal. Emotionally supportive parenting was not trending. And yet, Romans loved their children, in a stern, practical way. They mourned them deeply when they died, which happened often. Gravestones for children are some of the most quietly sad artifacts we have. Short lives, long inscriptions. Religion in Rome was everywhere. Gods for doors, gods for crossroads, gods for toilets, probably. People didn't worry about belief so much as ritual. You honored the gods correctly. You made offerings. You didn't offend anyone divine. It was less about faith and more about risk management. Households had shrine corners. Public spaces had temples. Omens were taken seriously. Birds were consulted. The future was read in animal organs. If something went wrong, it was because someone skipped a ritual. Probably you. And through all of this, Rome just kept going. Crowded, noisy, uncomfortable. A city held together by habit and hierarchy. Most Romans were tired. They worked a lot. They worried about rent. They complained about politicians. They stood in line for grain distributions. In many ways, deeply relatable. So, as we drift forward, deeper into Roman life, keep this version in mind. Not the marble statue Rome, but the cramped apartment Rome, the garum-scented Rome, the Rome where survival was normal and comfort was optional. We'll keep moving slowly. No rush. Rome is going nowhere. So, as Rome keeps humming along in the background, we drift gently into the daily routine. Not the exciting parts, not the parades, just the rhythm of ordinary Roman life. The kind of life that didn't make it into statues. Most Romans woke up early, not because they were disciplined, but because the city demanded it. Light meant activity, and activity meant survival. If you were poor, you probably didn't have much furniture. A bed, maybe, a stool, some storage jars. Minimalism, but not by choice. Breakfast was light, if it happened at all, usually bread dipped in wine. This was considered normal. The wine was watered down, but still. Hydration meant optimism. Then came work. Tradesmen opened shops, porters hauled goods, laborers lined up hoping someone needed muscles that day. Rome ran on human effort. And there was always more work than comfort. The streets were narrow, crowded, full of people going nowhere urgently. And animals, always animals. Carts had damaged the roads so badly that walking required focus. Stones were uneven, mud collected, waste lingered. Still, people navigated it daily, because they had to. One of the great stabilizers of Roman life was grain, specifically free grain. The annona, Rome's grain dole, kept hundreds of thousands of people fed, or at least not starving. Citizens lined up regularly to receive their ration. Bread wasn't a luxury, it was a political necessity. Emperors knew this, which is why bread in circuses wasn't a joke, it was policy. If grain shipments were delayed, the city panicked. Riots happened. Politicians suddenly became very interested in logistics. This dependence shaped Roman psychology. People understood that stability was fragile. Food security was not guaranteed, and when it failed, everything unraveled. So bread mattered. A lot. Entertainment, meanwhile, was everywhere, and mostly loud. Public spectacles weren't just distractions, they were social glue. Theater, races, games. The Circus Maximus could hold hundreds of thousands of people, which is staggering. Imagine that many people watching chariots race at dangerous speeds while cheering for colors. Teams were identified by colors: red, blue, green, white. People were emotionally invested, deeply. Fights broke out, careers ended, lives were ruined over team loyalty. Charioteers were celebrities. They were rich, they were famous. They were also frequently killed in accidents. This was accepted. Risk was part of the entertainment. The crowd didn't come for safety, they came for distraction, and maybe a sense of shared excitement in a life that didn't offer much of it elsewhere. The theater was more refined. Sort of. Plays were loud, actors wore masks, the plots were familiar. Comedy involved slapstick and insults. Tragedy involved suffering that everyone expected. Audience behavior was casual. People talked, they ate, they came and went. Silence was not required. Engagement was. And then there were gladiators, which we'll approach calmly, because despite what movies suggest, they were not an everyday event. Gladiatorial games were expensive. They were sponsored by elites looking for popularity. They were staged occasionally, not constantly. And most gladiators did not fight to the death. They were investments. Training them took time and money. Still, injury was common, death happened, and the crowd watched with interest. This wasn't seen as cruelty. It was ritualized violence, contained, expected. It fit into a worldview where life was uncertain and spectacle helped people cope with it. Now let's talk about hygiene again. Briefly, gently. Public toilets were communal. We mentioned this. They were also social spaces. People chatted. They conducted business. They shared that sponge. Hand washing was not emphasized. Germ theory was not trending. Disease spread easily. Crowded living conditions made epidemics inevitable. Plagues swept through Rome periodically. People prayed, doctors guessed, life continued. Medical knowledge existed. Some treatments helped. Some were deeply unhelpful. Bloodletting was popular, because it always is. Still, Romans valued health. They exercised, they bathed, they followed dietary advice. They just didn't know what bacteria were, which complicated things. Family life was structured and hierarchical. The father, the pater familias, held legal power over everyone in the household, including adult children, including slaves. This power was absolute in theory. In practice, social norms restrained it, mostly. Marriage was practical. Romantic love was optional. Divorce was easy, especially for men. Women managed households. They raised children. They handled finances. They had more freedom than in some other ancient societies, but they were still legally dependent. Love existed. Affection existed. So did neglect and disappointment and resentment. Rome did not invent family drama. It refined it. As evening approached, the city shifted again. Shops closed, fires were lit, cooking smells filled the air. Lighting was limited. Oil lamps flickered. Streets darkened. Crime increased. People stayed indoors, or gathered quietly, or visited taverns. Taverns were loud, full of smoke, full of cheap wine, full of arguments. This is where you heard gossip, complaints, political opinions. Romans loved complaining about taxes, about officials, about neighbors. Some things never change. As night settled, Rome did not sleep deeply. It dozed, restlessly. Sounds carried, fires sparked, someone shouted, a cart rolled past. People slept lightly because they had to. And then, slowly, morning came again. Another day, another repetition. Life in Rome wasn't glorious. It wasn't cinematic. It was routine, demanding, occasionally amusing, often exhausting. And yet, millions lived it, year after year, generation after generation. So, as we continue drifting forward, keep holding on to this version of Rome, the lived-in one, the imperfect one. Because next, we'll start brushing up against the people at the top, the ones with power, money, and deeply human flaws. And somehow, that part gets even quieter. So now, without any sudden movements, we slowly drift upward. Not spiritually, socially. We leave the insulae behind, the creaking staircases, the questionable ceilings, and we step politely into the world of people who thought Rome belonged to them, because, technically, they did. The Roman elite lived very different lives, but not necessarily calmer ones. Money solved many problems. It also created entirely new ones. Their houses, the domus, were designed to impress. From the outside, they looked plain, almost boring. This was intentional. Roman modesty was a performance. Inside, though, everything opened up. Courtyards, fountains, painted walls, mosaics reminding visitors how cultured the owner definitely was. Guests entered through the atrium, where the head of household greeted them each morning. This was the salutatio. Clients showed up, they paid respects, they waited, sometimes for hours. Patronage was the backbone of Roman society. If you were powerful, people depended on you. If you weren't, you depended on someone who was. This wasn't charity, it was obligation. Everyone owed someone something, and this meant even the wealthy rarely felt relaxed. Senators, in particular, lived under constant pressure. They had status, they had influence, they also had expectations stacked on expectations. A senator was supposed to be dignified, moral, traditional, publicly restrained. Privately, many were anything but. Affairs were common, debt was common, anxiety was extremely common. Politics in Rome was ruthless, not always violent, but always personal. Insults mattered, reputation mattered. A single scandal could ruin a family name built over centuries. And Roman gossip traveled fast because everyone was watching everyone else. Now, above even the senators hovered the emperors. Not gods, not kings, just men. Very powerful men, with very little privacy. Being emperor wasn't a job description, it was a condition. You lived in palaces, yes, but you were never alone. Servants, guards, advisors, informants. Everyone listened, everyone watched, everyone remembered. Which tends to mess with a person. Some emperors handled this reasonably well, others did not. Augustus, the first emperor, tried to pretend he wasn't one. He dressed modestly. He lived simply. He insisted Rome was still a republic. This was technically untrue, but it made people feel better. He worked constantly, reformed laws, reorganized administration, micromanaged morality. He even tried to regulate adultery, which did not go well. He exiled his own daughter for having too much of a personal life, because nothing says stable governance like family drama codified into law. Later emperors leaned into the role more openly. They wore the power. They enjoyed the privileges. They also lived with constant paranoia. Assassination was not rare. Poison was fashionable. Trust was optional. Meals were risky. Doctors were suspicious. Friends were temporary. And yet, emperors still hosted banquets, lavish ones. These meals were performances. Guests reclined on couches, food was served in courses, conversation flowed carefully. Dishes included exotic animals, rare fruits, elaborate sauces. Vomiting between courses was sometimes encouraged because moderation was not the goal. The goal was abundance, excess, proof. Clothing also signaled status. Togas were not practical, they were symbolic. They were heavy, difficult to wear, and very easy to trip over, which was the point. You didn't wear a toga to work, you wore it to be seen. Most Romans preferred tunics. Togas were for public life, for ceremony, for reminding everyone who mattered. Colors mattered. Purple was restricted. Too much purple and people got nervous. This was not fashion, it was politics. Women of the elite lived in a strange space. They had influence, sometimes immense influence, but rarely official recognition. They hosted gatherings, managed estates, raised heirs, and quietly shaped decisions. Some were highly educated, some wrote letters that survived. Some were remembered primarily through male complaints. Roman historians loved blaming women for things, especially ambitious women. If an emperor was cruel, his wife was manipulative. If politics went badly, someone's mother was probably involved. Still, these women navigated a system not designed for them, often skillfully, sometimes ruthlessly. Despite the luxury, elite life was not comfortable in a modern sense. There was no air conditioning, no insulation, no real privacy. Houses were open to clients, servants moved constantly, noise carried. Even the rich dealt with smoke, heat, cold, and illness. Disease did not respect status. Plagues did not check invitations. Emperors died young. Children died often. Grief was frequent. Which brings us gently to death. Romans were familiar with death, intimately. Funerals were public affairs. Processions moved through streets. Masks of ancestors were worn. Speeches praised lineage. Tombs lined roads outside the city. You couldn't avoid reminders of mortality. Elite families built monuments, inscribed names, preserved memory, because in Rome, being remembered mattered more than being comfortable. So as we continue drifting through this world, notice the irony. Those with the most power often had the least peace. Those with the most wealth lived under the most scrutiny. Rome rewarded ambition. It also punished it. And yet, people kept striving, kept scheming, kept hosting banquets and building monuments, because that was Rome, a city of contradictions, grandeur layered over anxiety, order balanced on exhaustion. We'll keep moving forward, slowly, calmly. There's still plenty of Rome left to quietly exist in. So, now that we're comfortably wandering through Rome's social layers, we drift into something the Romans were extremely proud of. Law. They loved law. They really did. They talked about it constantly. They wrote it down. They carved it into stone. They argued about it endlessly. And yet, living under Roman law was less about justice and more about navigation. Knowing where you stood. Knowing who you knew. Knowing when to keep your head down. Because Roman law was everywhere, and also very flexible, depending on who you were. In theory, Rome was a city of laws, not kings. Even under emperors, this fiction remained important. Magistrates existed, courts existed, judges existed, so did lawyers. And Romans loved lawyers almost as much as people love them today, which is to say, not much. Court cases were public. Anyone could attend, and many did, because it was entertainment. Trials involved speeches, long ones, dramatic ones. Evidence mattered less than persuasion. Rhetoric was king. If you could talk well, you could win. Cicero built his career on this. He was eloquent, self-important, and deeply anxious, which made him very Roman. Punishments depended heavily on status. This is important. If you were elite, penalties were mild. Fines, exile, a stern lecture. If you were poor, things escalated quickly. Public humiliation, forced labor, execution. Crucifixion existed, but it was reserved almost entirely for slaves and non-citizens. It wasn't just a punishment, it was a message. Citizens were spared the worst because citizenship mattered. A lot. This created a deep awareness of hierarchy. People knew where they stood, and they behaved accordingly. Policing was informal. There was no modern police force. Instead, Rome relied on social pressure, magistrates, and eventually night watchmen. The vigiles acted as firefighters and peacekeepers. They patrolled streets at night, they dealt with fires, they handled disturbances. They were not glamorous. They were not especially respected. Crime still happened. Thefts, scams, assaults. Rome was a city of opportunity, including criminal opportunity. Fire was one of Rome's greatest fears, and also one of its most frequent problems. Buildings were packed tightly together. Construction was cheap. Cooking involved open flames. Fires spread fast, and once they started, stopping them was difficult. People formed bucket lines. Walls were torn down to create fire breaks. Entire neighborhoods vanished overnight. The Great Fire of Rome under Nero was the most famous, but smaller fires happened constantly. This meant many Romans lived with the quiet understanding that everything they owned could disappear in a few hours, which is not exactly relaxing. Time in Rome moved differently. Not faster, just less precisely. There were no mechanical clocks. Time was measured by sundials and water clocks. Daylight hours were divided into 12 parts, which meant hours were longer in summer and shorter in winter. Appointments were approximate. Punctuality was flexible. Waiting was expected. This suited Roman temperament just fine. Life wasn't scheduled tightly. It unfolded. Travel was slow, but surprisingly organized. Roman roads were excellent. Stone-paved, engineered, straight. They connected the empire, allowed armies to move, goods to flow. Travelers stayed at inns which were functional. Privacy was minimal, comfort was optional, safety varied. Still, people traveled. Merchants, officials, messengers. The empire felt connected, despite its size. Communication relied on messengers and letters, which meant news traveled unevenly. A rebellion might be happening hundreds of miles away and you wouldn't know yet. Rumors filled the gaps. People speculated, gossiped, assumed. This uncertainty shaped Roman anxiety. Control was never complete. Religion again slips into daily life here. Oaths were sworn before gods. Contracts invoked divine witnesses. Breaking a promise wasn't just illegal, it was impious. Festivals punctuated the calendar. Days off were common. Work stopped for rituals. Some festivals were solemn, others were chaotic. Saturnalia, for example, temporarily inverted social roles. Slaves were served by masters, rules relaxed, gifts were exchanged. It was controlled chaos, a release valve. Then, everything snapped back into place. Education, for those who received it, emphasized memorization and discipline. Students copied texts, recited speeches, endured beatings. Teachers were often slaves or freedmen, respected for knowledge, underpaid for their patience. Learning was not gentle, but it was valued, especially rhetoric. Always rhetoric. Philosophy existed. Stoicism was popular. It encouraged emotional control, acceptance of fate, which made sense because so much was out of one's control. Epicureanism also had followers. It emphasized pleasure, but not excess. Romans misunderstood it frequently, assuming it meant indulgence. It didn't, but that didn't stop them. As evening returned again, Rome settled into itself. Shadows lengthened, oil lamps flickered. People reflected, or didn't. Life was not introspective for most. It was practical. Get through the day, avoid trouble, hope tomorrow was manageable. And somehow, across centuries, this worked. Rome endured. Not because it was comfortable, not because it was kind, but because it adapted, improvised, kept going. So we continue, unhurried, unimpressed, because next we drift into something deeply Roman. Belief in destiny, in legacy, in being watched by history. And that belief shaped everything. We'll let it settle in slowly.
So now we let Rome breathe for a moment. Not the city exactly, but the idea of Rome. The thing Romans believed they were living inside. Because beyond the noise, the crowds, the laws, and the breadlines, there was something else pressing down on everyone. A sense that life was being observed, measured, judged by gods, by ancestors, by history itself. Romans were deeply concerned with fate, not in a mystical crystal ball way, but in a practical one. Fate existed. You couldn't escape it. Your job was to meet it properly. This idea shaped how Romans handled success and failure. If something went well, it was because the gods approved. If it went badly, someone had offended someone divine, possibly you, possibly your neighbor, Possibly a chicken that didn't eat grain correctly. Yes, sacred chickens were consulted before major decisions. If they didn't eat, that was a bad sign. If they ate enthusiastically, good sign. If they refused entirely, plans were postponed, unless you were in a hurry, in which case you might throw the chickens overboard and proceed anyway. This did not usually end well. Omens were everywhere. Birds flying the wrong way, thunder at the wrong time, a stumble on the stairs. Nothing was neutral. Everything meant something. This created a low-level anxiety that never quite went away. You could do everything right and still offend the universe accidentally, which is probably why Romans developed such a strong sense of ritual. If you followed the rules carefully enough, maybe fate would leave you alone. Death, meanwhile, was not avoided. It was acknowledged constantly. Romans believed the dead lingered, not as ghosts haunting corridors, but as presences that required respect. Households honored ancestors regularly. Offerings were made. Names were remembered. For elites, ancestry was everything. Masks of ancestors were displayed during funerals, a visual reminder that you were part of a long line of expectations. This was not comforting, it was motivating. You didn't just live for yourself, you lived so your descendants wouldn't be embarrassed by you, which is a powerful incentive. Funerals were performances, carefully choreographed, public. Professional mourners were sometimes hired. They wailed, they gestured, they amplified grief. Eulogies focused on virtue, duty, service to Rome, even if the deceased had been deeply unpleasant, especially if they had been deeply unpleasant. Honesty was not the point. Legacy was. This obsession with memory extended into architecture. Buildings were named, statues erected, inscriptions carved. To be remembered was a goal. To be forgotten was the real death, which explains why Romans built so much, why they wrote so much, why they recorded names obsessively. Even ordinary people left inscriptions, simple ones, names, ages, short messages. I lived, I mattered, I was here. Superstition blended seamlessly with practicality. Amulets were worn, charms carried. Children wore protective jewelry to ward off evil. Homes had symbols painted near doors. This wasn't seen as irrational, it was common sense. Why not take precautions? The world was unpredictable. Dreams were taken seriously, very seriously. A vivid dream could change plans, prompt sacrifices, send someone to consult a priest. Dream interpreters existed, they were busy. Nightmares were messages, good dreams were reassurance. Sleep, then, was not empty time, it was another space where the gods might interrupt, which probably didn't help insomnia. Now let's talk, gently, about emotion, because Romans had a reputation for stoicism, and sometimes that was accurate. Public emotional restraint was valued, especially for men. Crying openly was frowned upon, except for funerals or in poetry or during particularly persuasive speeches. Privately, though, Romans were emotional. Letters reveal affection, jealousy, loneliness. People missed each other, they worried, they hoped. They just didn't always show it in public. Love existed in many forms. Marriages were often arranged, but affection could grow. Sometimes it didn't. Extramarital relationships were common, accepted for men, risky for women. Poetry from the period is full of longing, frustration, sarcasm. Catullus, for example, wrote obsessively about his lover. He adored her, he resented her, he could not stop thinking about her, which feels very modern. Friendship mattered deeply. Patronage aside, personal bonds were important. Letters between friends survive. They talk about health, politics, annoyances. One friend complains about noise, another about delays, another about being bored in the countryside. Rome produced a lot of writing, not because everyone was profound, but because everyone wanted to be heard. As people aged, their relationship with Rome shifted. Youth was for ambition, old age was for reflection. If you lived long enough, you might retreat to the countryside, write, garden, complain about the city. This was the Roman dream, to leave Rome without losing relevance. Few managed it gracefully. And through all of this belief, fear, memory, life kept moving. Children grew, parents aged, cities expanded.
Rome changed slowly, inevitably. People adapted without realizing they were adapting, because from the inside, it just felt like life. So as we continue, drifting further along, we'll begin to notice something subtle. Not decline yet, just strain. The systems that worked, working harder. The rituals repeating more often. Nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic. Just the quiet sense that holding an empire together was tiring, and that even Rome eventually needed to rest. So now, we let the years pass a little. Not quickly, just enough to notice that Rome, for all its confidence, was always adjusting itself. From the inside, nothing felt like collapse. It rarely does. It felt like inconvenience, delays, extra rules, more officials. Life went on, but it required more effort. Let's return briefly to comfort, because Rome had luxuries, real ones, just unevenly distributed. The wealthy surrounded themselves with beauty, painted walls, gardens, statues copied from Greek originals. Greek culture was admired, collected, imitated. A Roman elite without Greek art was considered uncultured. A Roman elite who spoke Greek fluently was considered impressive. This admiration didn't extend to equality. Greeks were respected culturally, conquered politically. Rome absorbed cultures while insisting on dominance. It was very good at this. Music filled Roman life. Not symphonies, but instruments, flutes, lyres, drums. Music accompanied rituals, theater, banquets. It wasn't always refined. Sometimes it was loud, repetitive, hypnotic, but it was familiar, comforting. Art served a purpose. It wasn't abstract. It told you who mattered. Portraits were realistic to the point of discomfort. Wrinkles were shown, scars included. This wasn't vanity, it was honesty. Age meant experience. Experience meant authority. Idealized youth came later. Despite wealth, illness remained constant. No one escaped it. Lead pipes delivered water, which did not help. Dental care was basic. Infections were dangerous. People accepted pain as part of life. They complained, of course, but they endured, which is not the same as coping. The countryside offered relief, at least in theory. Villas dotted the landscape, places to escape city noise, to oversee farms, to breathe. Life there was slower, but not easier. Farming was labor-intensive. Weather was unpredictable. Slaves did most of the work. Owners supervised, managed, worried about yields. Food security still mattered, even to the rich. Meanwhile, the empire stretched. Borders expanded, then stabilized. Maintaining control required armies, taxes, administration. Soldiers were stationed far from home. They wrote letters, missed families. Military life was structured, disciplined, routine, not glamorous, mostly waiting. Rome depended on its provinces, grain from Egypt, wine from Gaul, olive oil from Spain. This interconnectedness was strength and vulnerability. Disrupt one supply line and anxiety followed. People noticed. They always do. Religion evolved quietly. New cults appeared. Foreign gods entered the city. Isis from Egypt, Mithras from the East. These religions offered something traditional Roman religion did not: personal salvation, comfort, meaning beyond civic duty. Some Romans embraced them, others distrusted them. Change made people nervous. It always does. Philosophers continued to advise calm acceptance. Stoicism remained popular. Control what you can, accept what you can't. This advice aged well because there was much that couldn't be controlled. At home, families adjusted. Birth rates declined among elites. Marriage laws tried to encourage reproduction. It didn't work very well. People delayed marriage, avoided children. Rome noticed. Rome worried. When a society starts legislating family life, it's usually already concerned. Entertainment grew elaborate, spectacles larger, games longer. This wasn't decadence, it was reassurance. As long as the games continued, Rome felt stable.
And yet, beneath all of this, small pressures accumulated: economic strain, political fatigue, administrative complexity. Not collapse, just heaviness. Life didn't suddenly change, it slowly required more from everyone, which meant people adapted, again. For ordinary Romans, this meant working longer, waiting more, trusting less. For elites, it meant managing appearances more carefully, aligning with power, avoiding missteps. For emperors, it meant vigilance and often isolation. Still, most people lived their lives without noticing these patterns. They focused on daily concerns: family, food, health. Empires are invisible to those living inside them. They just feel like life. So as we continue drifting, let's hold on to that. Rome didn't fall overnight. It didn't feel like a tragedy. It felt like routine stretched thin. And before anything dramatic ever happened, generations lived and died believing Rome was eternal, because that belief itself was part of the structure. And structures can last a very long time, even when they're tired.
So now we arrive, quietly, at the end of our long walk through Rome. Not the end of Rome itself, just the end of this particular day, this particular telling. Because life in ancient Rome didn't conclude with a dramatic final act. No swelling music, no sudden blackout. It ended the way most lives do, gradually, uneventfully, with people still worrying about tomorrow. For the average Roman, there was no sense of living in a legendary civilization. That idea came later, much later. They didn't wake up thinking, I am part of history. They woke up thinking about rent, about bread, about whether the roof leaked last night. Rome wasn't marble to them. It was dust, sweat, crowds, routine. Most people never saw an emperor up close, never entered the Senate, never attended a grand banquet. They lived in neighborhoods. They knew shopkeepers. They recognized faces. Their world was small and very immediate. As generations passed, customs shifted slowly, almost imperceptibly. Clothing styles changed, accents shifted. Buildings were repaired, rebuilt, repurposed. A temple became storage. A house became apartments. An old shrine faded into the background. Rome reused everything, including itself. People adapted without noticing. They always do. When crises came, and they did, they were experienced locally. A bad harvest, a fire, a disease. People mourned, complained, adjusted. They didn't think in terms of decline. They thought in terms of survival. History labels periods. People do not. Even when emperors changed rapidly, even when politics grew unstable, even when borders felt less secure, life inside the city continued. Markets opened, children played, letters were written, meals were cooked. Rome didn't stop being Rome because historians decided a chapter had ended. It just kept being lived in. Eventually, of course, things did change more noticeably. Administration shifted, power moved, languages evolved. But even then, the people living through it didn't feel like witnesses to an ending. They felt tired, concerned, busy, which is very human. So when we strip away the movies, the polished statues, the heroic speeches, what's left is something quieter. Ancient Rome was a place where most people lived modest lives, surrounded by noise, bound by hierarchy, comforted by routine. They laughed sometimes, they worried often, they hoped cautiously. They shared food, they shared space. They shared that sponge, unfortunately. They believed in gods, in fate, in memory. They wanted to be remembered, but mostly they wanted tomorrow to be manageable. And maybe that's the most honest version of Rome. Not an empire, not a myth, but a city full of people doing their best in conditions that were rarely ideal. People who didn't know they were ancient, people who didn't know they would be studied, people who were just living. So as we ease out of this and let the lights dim a little more, you can let Rome fade back into the background. The noise softens, the streets empty, the lamps flicker out, and somewhere in the distance, a city that thought it would last forever settles into another uneasy night, which, somehow, feels exactly right. Thanks for being here. Rest well.